The birth of invisibility. She can't pinpoint exactly when she first noticed the pattern. Maybe when she was 7 or 9. What's firmly etched into her memory is the feeling. One particular night stands out like an old photograph. A Wednesday dinner, the smell of freshly cooked rice, the soft sound of silverware against dishes. Today at school, my teacher picked my drawing to represent our class in the citywide contest. She said it like blowing soap bubbles, colourful, fragile, full of hope. The silence that followed didn't come right away. It was worse than that. It was filled by the sound of her dad's fork scraping his plate, her mum's distracted sigh as she got up mumbling, "I need to get more water," and finally, her brother's voice, 2 years older, "Dad, can I go to Lucas's birthday party on Saturday? Everyone's gonna be there." She felt every unacknowledged syllable slide back inside her. The unreturned words sank back where they came from, like unwanted visitors going home. The pride in her chosen drawing shrank in her chest, collapsing into a little period that never got a chance to end the conversation. She tried again, this time making her voice sound more upbeat, more worthy of attention. "My teacher said it's the best drawing she's seen in years." Her dad glanced briefly at his phone vibrating on the table. Her mum came back with the water pitcher, already answering her brother about the party. "We'll have to see if your dad can take you, because I'm on call Saturday." At that precise moment, she learned her first lesson about her place in the world. Her voice didn't carry enough weight to reach the ears around her. Dinner went on. People chewed, gestured, and spoke, weaving a shared reality in which she had no real part. Meanwhile, she learned to swallow not just her food, but her own existence. Somewhere along the line, the food lost its taste. At some point, she stopped trying. Sitting at that family table, she developed the ability to be there physically, but remain emotionally absent, like a silent shell of a person. That scene, which probably seemed trivial to everyone else, was carved deep within her. It became a defining moment of an unspoken truth. If she wanted to exist in that family, it was better not to demand existence. To belong, she had to unlearn the basic human need to be seen. That night, lying in bed, she looked at her prize-winning drawing, a blue bird in flight with wide open wings against an orange sky. She didn't know why, but she tucked it into a folder under other school papers. Somehow, she sensed that celebrating alone hurt less than sharing a celebration that went unnoticed. Little by little, the silence of those around her turned into her own silence. Each time she was ignored, it added another brick in the wall between her and the world, a wall that both protected and trapped her. Years later, she would realize that dinner wasn't a random event, but the perfect symbol of a family dynamic that would shape her psyche for decades. What she couldn't have known that night is that Jung would have called this an initiatory wound, the moment a complex begins to form. Her bluebird drawing, tucked away, was the perfect archetypal symbol, freedom and spontaneous expression forced into hiding. The unconscious message was clear: fly within yourself, never in the open sky of others. Block 2. A cycle of pain, crystallizing the pattern. Years passed with the eerie speed that only repetition can bring. The silenced little girl became a teenager, and then a woman, carrying with her an unwritten handbook on how to make herself small enough not to bother anyone, but still useful enough to justify her presence. At school, she got known not for speaking up, but for listening. She was the confidant, the friend who held the group's emotional fabric together without ever taking center stage. Her friends would come to her to vent about love affairs, betrayals, dreams, and fears. "You're so good at listening," they'd say, never realizing she'd mastered the art of being the audience because she was never taught to be the star. Rarely did anyone ask about her feelings. Even more rarely did they truly wait for an answer if they did. She noticed how other people's eyes glazed over whenever she talked about herself, like her social role was to reflect others' brightness and never to shine on her own. Her early romantic relationships repeated the pattern with Swiss clock precision. She was drawn to self-absorbed men who saw her as the perfect audience for their endless self-praise. "You're different from the others," they'd say, so understanding. Without knowing it, they meant, "You don't compete with me for emotional space. You don't demand reciprocity. You don't push to be seen." She perfected her ability to guess others' needs before they even expressed them. Like she had a sixth sense for subtle mood changes. "How did you know I needed this?" they would ask, amazed when she preemptively satisfied their desires. They never realized it was a skill born of fear, not generosity. A child whose needs are never acknowledged often grows into an adult hyper-aware of everyone else's. In the professional world, her path went the expected route. She chose a support career, less by true calling, more by an unconscious push toward the backstage of life. She became exceptional at organizing, facilitating, and making other people shine. Her bosses described her as the kind of employee every company needs. Efficient, discreet, solving problems without causing new ones. She never asked for raises, rarely took time off, and calmly watched as less competent but more assertive colleagues got promoted over her. "Your time will come," they'd say occasionally, though neither she nor they really believed it. In meetings, her presence was so understated that she had to repeat her ideas multiple times, or watch as someone else claimed them minutes later. Eventually, she started sharing her insights with a specific co-worker beforehand, so at least her contributions would reach the table through someone else's voice. At home, alone, she had compensatory self-care rituals. She bought herself the flowers no one else did, cooked elaborate dinners for herself, eaten by candlelight, talked to her plants, to her cat, sometimes just to her own reflection. It was an unconscious attempt to create the mirroring she never got growing up. On social media, she was a quiet observer. She rarely posted about her own life, but kept track of everyone else's in detail. She curated a minimal digital presence while following everyone else's flamboyant online lives, liking, commenting with praise, celebrating the wins of her acquaintances. Meanwhile, her own achievements went undocumented, as if they needed to stay invisible to remain real. At night, she'd often feel an inexplicable emptiness that no external success seemed able to fill. "What's wrong with me?" she'd wonder, looking at a seemingly functional life, but feeling perpetually incomplete. It was as if she were living at the edges of her own existence, watching the movie she was meant to star in. On the rare occasions she felt genuinely seen by a perceptive friend, she felt an almost painful rush of emotion. Those brief moments of real recognition felt like quenching an ancient thirst. But the fear always came back. Fear of taking up too much space, of being too much, of existing too loudly. Jung would see in this pattern what he called a complex in action, a constellation of behaviors, thoughts, and emotions anchored in the original wound. Every time she let herself become invisible, the inferiority complex grew stronger. Every unequal relationship confirmed her unconscious belief she wasn't worthy of attention. Every uncelebrated achievement confirmed that nagging sense of insignificance. Painful cycles don't just repeat themselves, they spiral deeper. The more the pattern repeated, the truer it felt to her unconscious. The ignored girl at the family dinner table was now a woman who didn't expect to be heard anywhere. Invisibility, initially imposed, was now an identity she'd seemingly chosen. Block 3. Jung's explanation. The devaluation complex as a collective shadow. Carl Gustav Jung, in his broad exploration of the human psyche, offered a profound understanding of this phenomenon of emotional invisibility. In Jung's view, what happens around the family dinner table isn't just a personal drama, it's a microcosm where archetypal forces reveal themselves through our most intimate relationships. The pain of invisibility isn't just the absence of light, it's the presence of too much shadow. In Jungian terms, the shadow holds all parts of ourselves that got rejected, repressed, or denied during our development. When a child's spontaneous expression is repeatedly ignored, it isn't just her voice that's silenced. An entire potential way of being is forced into darkness. Jung might say, a soul that didn't receive mirroring in childhood ends up living on the margins of its own being. This concept of mirroring, later developed by psychoanalysts like Winnicott and Kohut, is implicitly understood in Jung's model of personality growth. To form a solid sense of self, a child needs to see herself reflected in the eyes of the people who matter most, especially her parents. When that mirroring fails consistently, a false self takes root, a persona adapted to please others and maintain minimal connection, but cut off from the true self. This inner split is the birth of the inferiority complex, the deeply held belief that one's authentic self isn't valuable enough to deserve attention and love. Once formed, a complex operates like an autonomous system in the psyche, a subpersonality with its own agenda, feeding on any experience that confirms its central message: you're not enough. As Jung explained, complexes tend to attract situations and people who reinforce them, creating a self-perpetuating loop that can last a lifetime if not recognized and integrated consciously. What makes this process particularly tricky is that the devaluation complex often disguises itself as virtue. The invisible person is praised for being selfless, always thinking of others first, being so giving of time and energy. Society, and especially women, are often applauded for this self-erasure as an ideal of femininity and kindness. What should be recognized as an emotional wound ends up being socially rewarded. Jung saw that this phenomenon has both personal and collective dimensions. On a personal level, it's the painful adaptation of an individual to an emotionally deficient family environment. On a collective level, it shows how certain cultures and family structures systematically prize some forms of expression while dismissing others, creating what Jung called a cultural shadow. In many families, there's an unspoken hierarchy of attention. Some members are labeled important, often the breadwinner or a child seen as especially gifted or troubled, while others are relegated to support roles. This uneven distribution is rarely acknowledged but deeply felt, especially by the child whose emotional life is made peripheral. Thus, the inferiority complex doesn't just arise from overt rejection, but perhaps more painfully from chronic indifference. As Jung would say, indifference has a paralyzing power. Negative actions at least show you matter enough to provoke anger. The chronically ignored child receives the most devastating message of all. Their very existence is too insignificant to warrant recognition. Jung knew that the light we're denied never goes away. It's banished to the shadow. And in this reservoir of the repressed hidden life energy can turn into symptoms: chronic anxiety, depression, psychosomatic disorders, constant fatigue, or a weakened immune system. The body often expresses what the voice has been conditioned to silence. One relevant Jungian concept is shadow inflation. When big parts of the true self are refused any conscious outlet, they become more powerful in the unconscious. A person who never expresses anger might one day explode in disproportionate rage. Someone who never acknowledges their own needs could develop extreme codependence or severe isolation. What makes Jung's perspective so valuable is that he didn't see this complex as a life sentence, but as a call to integration. The pain of invisibility, viewed through a Jungian lens, becomes an invitation to individuation, the journey in which we reconcile our fragmented parts to become more whole and authentic. Ironically, invisibility can become the doorway to a deeper kind of visibility, one not dependent on external eyes, but born of our own inner recognition. It begins the journey of seeing ourselves with the attention and care we always wanted from others. Block 4. A turning point. The letter as a ritual of integration. On a rainy fall Sunday, after yet another family gathering where her words had gone unnoticed, she finally reached a breaking point. There was no dramatic collapse, just a moment of clarity, like fog lifting over a valley long hidden. She headed home, feeling that familiar emptiness, but something was different this time. One question wouldn't leave her. What if I wrote to the only person who truly knows how I feel? The idea came as an intuition, writing a letter to the little girl she used to be, the one who sat at the dinner table with her award-winning drawing and got no recognition. She sat at her desk, took out paper and pen, feeling this needed the intimacy of handwriting, not a keyboard. For a few minutes, she just breathed, sensing the weight of it. How do you reach out to a part of yourself trained to disappear? "Dear girl with the blue drawing," she began, and the words poured out like water from a long-sealed dam. "I saw your drawing, the bluebird with wide wings against the orange sky. I saw the hope in your brushstrokes, the freedom in that flight you imagined. I saw how excited you were when the teacher chose it from all the others. And I saw, above all, how that joy was ignored at the dinner table. I want you to know there was nothing wrong with your excitement, nothing wrong with your need to be seen, nothing wrong with you. The silence that followed your words that night wasn't your fault. It was a symptom of a family dynamic that didn't know how to honor everyone's voice equally. Your parents and brother were stuck in their own patterns, their own unresolved invisibility. If I could go back to that dinner, you know what I'd do? I'd sit beside you. I'd look you right in the eyes and say, 'Tell me about that drawing. How did you choose those colors? What does that bird mean to you? How did it feel to be chosen?' And then I'd really listen. Since that night, you've learned to shrink yourself. You've learned to be the listener, the helper, the one who doesn't bother anyone. You built an entire life around believing your voice doesn't matter. And look where that's brought us, always giving to others and keeping the crumbs for ourselves. This letter is the start of a promise. From now on, I'm going to be the person we always looked for in others. I'll be the one who genuinely cares about my thoughts, who celebrates my wins, who validates my feelings, even the messy ones. It won't be easy. Decades of invisibility don't vanish overnight. There will be setbacks, times I'll shrink again, moments my voice will tremble. But the difference is, now someone's paying attention. Me. Keep your drawing, little one. Not buried at the bottom of a pile, hidden from everyone, but in a place of honor. That blue bird has always been flying inside us. It's time to let it soar in the open skies. When she finished, she noticed silent tears had streaked the page, creating tiny ripples in the ink. They weren't just tears of sadness, but of recognition, like finally being seen after a lifetime of invisibility. In Jungian terms, what she had done was a powerful integration ritual. The letter represented a dialogue between her conscious adult self and the wounded inner child exiled to her shadow for being too much for the family system. By acknowledging that child and validating her feelings, she'd begun the process of rescuing that vital energy, banished to the edges of her awareness. It wasn't just a therapeutic exercise, it was an act of psychic alchemy. Jung saw transformation as turning the lead of painful experiences into the gold of self-knowledge. By naming her pain and weaving a coherent story around a wound that had only existed as vague hurt, she created conditions for its transmutation. In the days after writing the letter, she noticed small changes. In a work meeting, when someone cut her off, she calmly said, "I'd like to finish my point, please." At lunch with a friend who talked endlessly about themselves, she found the courage to say, "Now I'd like to share something important that happened to me." At the next family dinner, she deliberately introduced a topic she cared about, and when they tried to shift focus, she gently but firmly brought it back. Everyone was surprised, her included. These small acts didn't magically fix all her outside relationships. Some family members felt uneasy with her new assertiveness. Some friends, used to her quiet listening, looked caught off guard. But something even more important was happening. Her internal relationship was changing. She was beginning to find within herself the validation she'd always looked for externally. She kept the letter as a talisman in her journey. On days when old patterns tried to pull her back, she reread it. Sometimes she added new paragraphs, updates to her younger self about big or small victories in freeing herself from invisibility. A few months later, in a therapy session, her therapist suggested something unexpected. What if you asked the little girl to write back? The idea terrified her at first. Giving a voice to that silenced part felt risky, like opening a door to a flood of emotions. But one sleepless night, she felt compelled to try. Using her left hand instead of her usual right, a Jungian technique to access deeper material, she let the blue drawing girl respond. The shaky, almost childlike handwriting spelled out something unexpectedly simple. I just wanted someone to say my bird was pretty, for someone to ask why I picked blue. Blue is the color of a sky without limits. In its directness, that response made her sob. It was a deep release, what Jung would call the catharsis needed to integrate shadow. The expressed need was so basic, so fundamentally human, to be seen, to feel valued in her unique expression. From that moment on, the letter turned into an ongoing conversation, a channel between the grown woman she was and the little girl she'd been. That inner dialogue would form the foundation of a new relationship with herself, and by extension, with the world. Block 5. Closure, individuation. As a path to self-recognition, real transformations rarely happen overnight. The process Jung called individuation, becoming psychologically whole, unfolds over a lifetime. For her, every turn in that spiral was a chance to understand herself more deeply and choose to break the old pattern. She realized she didn't have to shout to exist. Her presence could be felt not by loudness, but by authenticity. She discovered a quiet power in simply occupying her space without apologizing for it. She also realized her journey wasn't about being acknowledged by others. It was about learning to see herself with the loving eyes she'd always sought externally. By bringing her invisible inner child into conscious light, she saw that many of her truest gifts were wrapped up in that neglected part of herself. Her spontaneous creativity, her heightened sensitivity, her intuitive awareness of unspoken feelings. Over time, her relationship with her family shifted too, not because they dramatically changed, but because she changed her role in the family dynamic. She was no longer the passive recipient of invisibility, but a conscious observer setting healthier boundaries and, when possible, expressing her needs without clinging to the need for their approval. In friendships, she started gravitating toward people who could genuinely reciprocate, and away from those who preferred one-sided emotional transactions. She found that her deep capacity for listening was a true gift, but only when balanced by expressing her own truth. At work, she stepped into roles she once thought unreachable, not by suddenly becoming loud or domineering, but by realizing her calm and thoughtful voice held real weight. Colleagues and bosses picked up on something new. Her presence now had substance, a quiet magnetism born of authenticity rather than volume. Jung described this as the return of the repressed, not in the sense of chaotic eruptions from the unconscious, but in the gentle reintegration of all those disowned aspects of herself. The parts cast into the shadow often hold our greatest vitality and creativity once they're finally given space in our conscious life. One day, while reorganizing old boxes for a move to a new home, a place she chose entirely on her own for herself, she found something she'd long forgotten. That original drawing. The blue bird against the orange sky, slightly faded but still vibrant in its original intent. She framed it and hung it in a place of honor in her new office, not just as a reminder of the wound, but as a testament to the journey. After all, that bird had never stopped flying. It was simply waiting for her to be ready to join it in the sky. When friends asked about the framed picture, she shared her story without shame or drama, just as an important part of her psychological biography. She realized that by openly talking about her experience of invisibility, she created a space where others could recognize their own unspoken wounds. That's how she found herself, almost unintentionally, leading small circles of women sharing similar stories. Not as a therapist, though she later pursued training in Jungian psychology, but as a fellow traveler who'd already mapped part of a familiar terrain. In these circles, she saw that simply naming the experience of invisibility was, in itself, an antidote to its paralyzing power. She watched women write letters to their own inner children, rediscover lost voices, and allow themselves to exist emotionally without guilt or fear. In Jungian terms, she turned her personal wound into a service to collective consciousness, the highest expression of individuation. It was no longer just her healing. It was about challenging a cultural pattern that systematically sidelines certain voices, particularly female ones. Sometimes, she still felt the old gravitational pull of the complex. Stress or vulnerability could summon that old internal voice whispering, "Stay small, don't be a bother." But now, she recognized the regression for what it was, a learned response, not the truth about her worth. On her 40th birthday, once a date she would have let slip by uncelebrated, she gathered a small group of dear ones. During dinner, as people shared their memories and gratitude, she marveled at how she'd fostered a community built on real reciprocity. In that moment, she fully understood what Jung meant by becoming who you are. It wasn't about turning into someone else, but returning to her original essence, who she was before the world taught her to disappear. The girl who drew the blue bird and the woman she'd become were not separate people. They were integrated parts of a continuous, evolving self. The journey from invisibility to genuine presence doesn't have a neat final destination. It's an ongoing path of self-awareness, recalibration, and conscious choice. Most importantly, it's a journey she was now awake for, a spiraling upward, not a vicious cycle. For anyone who might see themselves in this story, here's a question. Did you also feel invisible as a child? What would you say to that forgotten child today? Maybe your invisibility looked different. Maybe you were the kid whose perfect grades were expected, not celebrated, or the one whose tears were met with "stop crying," or the one who learned to hide feelings because they were too much for the grown-ups around you. No matter how it shows up, not being truly seen during childhood can leave deep marks on the psyche. As Jung taught, they don't disappear by being ignored. They manifest in indirect and often painful ways in adulthood. The invitation here isn't to blame parents or caregivers who, in most cases, did their best with what they had. It's a call to recognize how these family patterns shape our self-image and how we can consciously choose a new way of relating to ourselves. Writing a letter to your inner child is just one tool among many. Some find healing through art, dance, movement, meditation, or formal therapy. The main thing is to be willing to look honestly at those hidden patterns that run our lives. As Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Recognizing emotional invisibility is the first step toward turning it from a predetermined fate into a story we can rewrite. Your story deserves to be seen and heard.